Its funding pulled and its staff sent home, the world's largest international humanitarian donor, USAID, is under assault. If the Trump administration doesn't restore the flow of aid, who will fill the void? And what does it mean for global US influence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. President Donald Trump's administration is dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. For decades, it's been the world's premier humanitarian agency, distributing life-saving medications, combating the spread of disease, and providing disaster relief in conflict zones. Thousands of employees have been placed on leave, and aid recipients in more than 130 countries have been left in limbo. Spearheading federal budget cuts is billionaire Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. While it may represent an instant saving on the books, will there be an unseen cost to American influence? And could the courts end up blocking yet another of Trump's endeavours? We'll get to those questions in a moment, but first this report by Michael Apple.
For more than 60 years, the United States Agency for International Development has been at the forefront of every global humanitarian initiative. Food parcels, medication, HIV/AIDS testing kits, civil service capacity building in developing nations. USAID was behind it all.
USAID has been the biggest HIV funder. And I would say that a number of people, close to 20 million people, are receiving ARVs, art treatment, testing services from the funds that USAID has been providing to us.
But that's all stopped, at least for now. US President Donald Trump sees the aid agency's 2023 budget of $40 billion as a waste of money, too woke, and not aligned with his America First agenda.
I love the concept, but they turn out to be radical left lunatics.
USAID was established by John F. Kennedy in 1961. He signed an executive order which created it as an independent agency. But it's come into the crosshairs of billionaire Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, a task force birthed via one of Trump's executive orders. USAID's website has been taken down, and a notice placing roughly 10,000 employees on administrative leave is all that remains. The announcement met with anger on the streets of Washington, D.C., and promises of court action.
The key issue with Musk's actions is that it's happening in this zone that we could best describe as a gray legal zone, or perhaps more accurately described as a zone of illegality. So he is effectively shutting down an American government agency. That requires an act of Congress.
It's a question that keeps cropping up.
Will it take an act of Congress to do away with USAID, or do you believe you have the
I don't know.
legal
I don't think
authority
so. No, not when it comes to fraud. If there's fraud, these people are lunatics. And if it comes to fraud, you wouldn't have an act of Congress.
Trump wants America to project strength at home and abroad. He's casting aside anything he sees as impacting his administration's bottom line. It's a move critics say declares the age of America's soft power well and truly over. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Hardin Lang, the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International. In Colchester in the UK is Natasha Lindstaedt, a US foreign policy specialist and a professor of government at the University of Essex. And in Nairobi is Alan Boswell, the International Crisis Group's project director for the Horn of Africa. A very warm welcome to all of you. Natasha, I'll start with you in Colchester. The US says that every dollar it spends has to be justified with the answer to the questions, does it make America safer, more stronger, and more prosperous? Is the freezing of USAID in line with these goals?
No, not at all. I mean, this is such a significant shift in U.S. humanitarian policy, and it is not making Americans safer, but it's definitely not making many people who are vulnerable safer, because USAID was instrumental in providing life-saving vaccines. I mean, all the work that, if we just even look at the area of global health, where USAID had worked in partnership with organizations like PEPFAR to help prevent the spread of AIDS, saving somewhere around 26 million lives, or had worked to support the malaria vaccine, or to fight malaria, which kills 450,000 children under 5. And their work on that has helped save some 7 million lives, or in fighting TB, which kills over 1 million people still. And their work on that has saved some 79 million people. So in addition to all the work that they do in the healthcare field, they're instrumental in disaster relief, in providing food aid, and also in support of democracy.
Yeah.
So this is really catastrophic on a number of fronts.
Hardin, Natasha talked about how devastating this is for vulnerable communities especially. How does it look for the world's richest man, Elon Musk, to be unplugging a lifeline to the world's poorest people?
I mean, honestly, if there were a way in which America has shown up in the rest of the world, in many of these communities that are facing humanitarian crisis, that are mired in poverty, AID and its programming have been that face. And what Elon Musk is doing, in essence, is pulling the plug on all of that. It's not hard to see how this narrative is going to play in countries and communities around the world, because it's already gathering some steam. I mean, the fact that you had sort of Russia and China welcome this move tells you a lot about what it's doing to U.S. soft power and the perception of the United States writ large. I mean, it's as though we have gone into hospitals and sort of unplugged the ventilators. People who were counting on their HIV meds the next day show up and the door is locked. The ripple effect of this throughout communities, what you have, I mean, in fact, we have women from Afghanistan, who are on the run from the Taliban inside of Afghanistan or in Pakistan, whose safe houses have had to shutter their doors. So the level at which this is going to ripple out across communities and countries amongst the world's poorest, but then even people who are watching this, our allies and partners, are we reliable as a country to show up both when they need it for humanitarian assistance or to support them in Ukraine, for example? Like the message is going to be clear that we are not reliable, and that actually an unaccountable billionaire, an oligarch, has the ability to unplug what has been a global lifeline and insurance policy.
And Alan, Africa is probably the region that will be most impacted by the freezing of this aid. What has been the fallout there already that you can tell, from soup kitchens where you are in Nairobi to the tens of millions in Sudan who need food aid?
Yeah, it's total mayhem. There's two, I'd say, main areas that have people especially worried, one of which is the amount of food aid coming from the United States. It's by far the largest donor to WFP and to other implementing partners. Although that technically food aid has, life-saving emergency food aid has a technical waiver, in practice, so many people have been laid off or put on leave that essentially, and many of the NGOs themselves have actually had to fire people or stop work, that the result has been no one even knows what's being delivered anymore. I've heard stories of NGOs actually returning food to WFP warehouses, for instance, because even though WFP's been allowed to continue, the NGOs have been so affected that they can't. These are in places where people are starving to death, such as in Sudan. The second one is the public health support, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. The U.S. was by far the biggest contributor there, and a lot of those programs are essentially on hold. Again, they might pick up, but I think the underlying thing to know is that in the meantime, it's unclear how much the U.S. will eventually come back and put and get some of these programs running again. But in the meantime, definitely Africans will die.
And Natasha, as Alan is saying, there has been so much confusion. I mean, you mentioned PEPFAR, which supports millions of people who need support for HIV, and even, the waiver about that is unclear. Absolute confusion. But do you think that this is something that this US administration will actually be able to do, whether it's merging USAID with the State Department or trying to scale it back to the level that it is?
I mean, USAID is not supposed to be part of the State Department. It's supposed to be independent, and it received congressional approval and funding for this. So it doesn't really work when it's part of the State Department, particularly this State Department led by Marco Rubio, who has really been promoting this Trump's agenda, that everybody that works for the Trump government administration has to be in line with Trump's ideological goals. And that's not really the purpose of a humanitarian agency or organization that is trying to save lives. And they're trying to find people who are disloyal and create a much leaner organization that will only have really lackeys, people without, the type of experience. I know they are keeping some people there, but I mean, the way that they've gutted the workforce is just incredible. You only have some 12 people working in Africa now, some 8 working in Latin America and the Caribbean, 21 people working for the entire Middle East and Asia. I mean, it's very difficult for an organization to function when it has been gutted so completely.
And Hardin, what kind of challenges do you expect to this from the US Congress itself?
Sure, but let me just go back to the question that was just asked, because I think this is super important. Like, part of what you're seeing now, the numbers that we're seeing is that we're going to have most of the USAID workforce laid off or furloughed. So we're getting to a point with about 290 officers are supposed to be transferred from USAID over to the State Department, right? If you say that USAID roughly has a budget of, say, $40 billion in a given year, and then, say, 10 to 14,000, depending on how you count them, employees working there overseeing that, if you're just transferring 300 people over to the State Department to oversee ongoing aid programs, they're going to have the capacity to oversee a fraction of that 40 billion. So we're talking about USAID total humanitarian and development aid going down to a couple of $2 billion if we're lucky in the interim. What's also happening here is, while we're waiting for Congress and the courts to really kick in to exercise their oversight, what you're having is the destruction of the agency through the cutting of contracts, through the firing of employees and furloughing, through the stop work orders, to the entire ecosystem of NGOs that support the system. So the goal here, I think, is to push Humpty Dumpty off the wall, have him hit and crash on the ground and shatter into a billion pieces before Congress can step in and act. I think the timeline that we're looking here for is that there's a reconciliation process, there's a budget process that's going to kick in the United States to try to keep the lights on for the government across the system by March 14th. The hope is that USAID will be able to kick in before that, or that the Congress will kick in to exercise its oversight and its actual constitutional authority here, because, to be honest, we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. The fact that the world's richest man has gone in and unplugged a system with some dubious authority to do so, this is the moment that Congress needs to step up and exercise its mandate for an agency that it has mandated the existence thereof. And the question is, can that happen in time?
Yeah, and Alan, while we wait for that to happen and see if that happens, in the meantime, countries like China are already filling the void in aid programs in the Pacific. How much of an opportunity is this for countries like China to fill the gap left by USAID?
It's an interesting question, because I actually think the type of programs USAID did at large is something that many will actually not come back and do. I think USAID, in hindsight, historically, I don't mean to talk about it in past tense already, but I think it'll probably, this will look like something like a closing chapter on a type of aid that it was viewed as being purposely apolitical, that was distributed intentionally almost, so there wasn't political leverage tied to it. The type of aid that will be coming in from Russia or China, for instance, will come with strings attached. It may very well be that future aid coming from the United States might have a lot more strings attached too. I think, and it goes without saying that there was obviously a lot of bloat in the system. There was a lot of aid that actually the countries themselves, the leaders themselves, even sometimes the people themselves didn't even like or want. I think there are kind of two categories. There's the very life-saving aid, which is highly disruptive to cut off. And then I do think there will be a lot of programs where there won't be many more who miss it or even notice that they're gone except for who they employed. And a lot of that will never be picked up by someone else.
Natasha, that's a really interesting point that Alan is making, that, not all of the aid, of course, the bulk of it is humanitarian, but not all of it is humanitarian. The really interesting thing is that while the humanitarian sector is reeling from this announcement, there are some authoritarian regimes, including Russia and China, but, everywhere from El Salvador, Belarus, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all cheering on the dismantling of US aid. Can you tell us why?
They are, because organizations like USAID that provide democracy support, that support civil society, that support human rights and the rule of law, these types of programs are, they undermine authoritarian regimes. And so they're often a target, whether it be them or other NGOs, which is why we saw a flurry of anti-NGO laws that were passed by authoritarian regimes. I mean, they really want these types of organizations to be dismantled because it poses a threat to their rule. And we have found that they can be effective in supporting civil society. And this is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin was so threatened by when there have been protests after fraudulent elections, because organizations like this help mobilize these groups and help spread best practices about pushing for accountability and transparency. So of course they're rejoicing. So it's not just that, but also, there is a void in soft power. I mean, China has spent in the last 12 years over $1 trillion in promoting, the Belt and Road Initiative and other forms of soft power, and there'll be a void there. With the loss of what looks like the loss of USAID, and in that it's not going to be supporting these human rights-based, democracy-based projects. And we do see that the level of democracy globally is affected by hegemons like the US and the quality of democracy in the US, of course, but the role that they play in supporting democracy around the world.
And Hardin, what impact do you see that having on, everything from civil society organizations to NGOs?
Sure. So let's take it in sort of two groups, right? There are like international NGOs who have footprints in a couple of countries in certain regions to a global presence, not dissimilar to that of the United Nations. For the international NGOs, what we're seeing, and contractors for USAID, is the global stop work orders has had like a catastrophic effect, right? We're seeing layoffs of 40% to 90% of staff. And this is once you've actually laid the staff off, sort of rebuilding that, if money were to come back online, is going to take a long time. It's going to take effort. And so you really are seeing a cascade effect across the ecosystem of implementing partners at the international NGO level that provided everything from sort of development assistance to the support for public health programs to the emergency humanitarian assistance that's supposed to have some waivers, but which in effect is not functioning. And that system is collapsing globally. At the civil society level inside of countries, these like civil society organizations, local organizations, really are sort of the front line of the effort, right? These are the folks who are on the front line in Ukraine and elsewhere, really providing assistance to communities in need and getting that money and support from the international NGOs and the United Nations. We're already hearing from a number of them that they're having to shut down their programming, right? And these organizations are critical not just for actually meeting needs, but they are the bedrock of civil society. And something that it's very deeply in the U.S. strategic interest to see civil society strengthening inside of countries, because a strong civil society, is good for stability, but it's also good for values. It's the sort of organizations that pursue democracy, anti-corruption, human rights issues, and there's a very real danger that the kind of external support upon which many of these civil society organizations rely is crumbling very quickly. And they will find ways to continue to survive, hopefully, but it's going to do very significant damage at a strategic level to civil society to sort of play the role that we always depend on civil society to play.
But Alan, do you think that this US administration is at all interested in building up strong civil societies in other countries? Because as Donald Trump and Elon Musk have repeatedly said, USAID's, what the USAID is doing is not aligned with the administration's goals.
Look, a lot of these civil society, quote unquote pro-democracy grants from USAID have had very strong bipartisan support for a long time, but it's clear that that support really doesn't come from the Trump administration. And a lot of other countries, I think, have stopped, also view this support as unwelcome as well. So you could see a Trump administration is very transactional. A lot of, I'll speak about Africa. A lot of African leaders don't really appreciate that the U.S. basically funds a lot of what we call civil society, what they see as political activists. And this can be a drag sometimes on their relations. You could see that Trump administration, which wants to take a very transactional approach, wants to do deals, doesn't have a great democracy record at home, to say the least. You could see why those sort of programs are not something that will, that'll get restarted. And we'll see how much appetite there is for actually restarting it after a Trump administration, and whether this bipartisan consensus that had been there in the U.S. system is now just gone.
Natasha, Alan was talking earlier about how China will not be interested, or China doesn't have the appetite to cover all the kinds of programs that the USAID funding gap will leave. It's a huge gap, but given that, they work on things that will affect countries beyond the borders where the aid is distributed, things like preventing organized crime, terrorism, conflict, and the impact that will have on human security. Are there any other countries that we can expect, maybe European nations, for example, to try and fill some of this gap?
That's a good question. I mean, traditionally, the Scandinavian countries in particular have been big donors. And of course, they've donated quite a bit in terms of a percentage of GDP. And they're often above the 0.7% that countries are supposed to spend on foreign aid. But it's hard to fill this gap because the U.S. was the biggest donor, even though the U.S. was far below what the expectations were in terms of both its federal budget, where it's under 1%, or its foreign aid was, 0.2% or something along those lines. It's hard for all these smaller countries to meet all the demands, all the humanitarian crises that are taking place around the world. Though I think you're going to see Europe trying to step up, but you have to also understand at the same time, Europe is facing huge costs with the ongoing war in Ukraine. And so there are so many fires to put out at the same time that this loss of the U.S. In terms of the role of a major foreign aid actor, it is really going to have monumental effects on human security.
Yeah, human security that it's already having around the world. Hardin, I was reading that the Democratic Party politicians have been talking about how it could jeopardize U.S. national security. They cited prison guards in Syria who are in charge of securing ISIL fighters temporarily walked off the job when the U.S. funding was cut off, for example.
Yeah, there are any number of examples of where the sort of the touch points between what USAID does and U.S. national security are quite clear. The example of the camps in northeast Syria, where in essence the administration had not thought through or recognized that if you pull the plugs on civilian assistance, you're going to pull the plug on one of the contractors in northeast Syria that was providing the security for the camps, where tens of thousands of ISIS families and probably some fighters were still living under the guard of the Syrian partners, other Syrian partners in the area. And this had a huge ripple effect across the system when people gained some visibility of it. But there are lots of other examples of this, or other places where the touch points between national security and development humanitarian assistance are clear. I mean, one thing just to keep in mind, let's go back to Ebola in 2014-15. Like, if that crisis, right, the Ebola crisis led to in West Africa, led to a huge mobilization on the part of the United States and others to contain it. And that's because when President Obama saw the projections of what could happen, the spread, the like millions of people who could be killed, and the possibility of that disease getting to the United States and doing very serious damage, a full court press effort was put into place involving civilian actors, the U.S. military and support, et cetera, to try to help and contain that. If, in essence, you're taking the tools from that toolkit and removing them, you are creating huge vulnerability to the United States, the massive spread of these kind of diseases. As we've seen under COVID, if you don't have those tools in the toolkit, there's very direct national security implications and human security implications, not just abroad, but in the United States.
And Alan, even if the cuts to USAID are going to be successfully challenged in the courts, just how much damage do you think this has already done, not just in terms of all of the people that aid has been cut off from, but to America's reputation as a reliable partner?
Sure. Well, I don't think the U.S. is seen as a reliable partner. That is not only because of the way USAID was put through the wood chipper, as it was said. But, the Trump administration coming in for a second term is seen by most other countries in the world as a signal that there is no continuity from the U.S. On many of these major issues. He's obviously a huge disruptor, and this is obviously a case in point. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what to expect from the U.S. from here on out on almost every single file. So I think this is another example of it. There's already been, on the African side, which is where I am, there's already been a lot of calls actually from leaders or former leaders saying, hey, it's now time for us to stop relying on this foreign aid and realize that we can't be dependent. And it's time to, fill our own public health budgets and things like this. So I think it is also a moment of reflection for countries to say they can't rely on the U.S. or necessarily anyone else moving ahead. But for sure, this is just, further convinced everyone that if they thought they could rely on the U.S. moving ahead, that they can't, and every 4 years could bring something entirely different.
All right, that is our discussion for today. Thank you to all of our guests, Hardin Lang in Washington, D.C., Natasha Lindstaedt in Colchester, and Alan Boswell in Nairobi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.